Welcome to the 11th session of Within the Shadow of the Galilean, from Galilee to Jerusalem. We've left Jesus in Galilee for a while, but I'm glad that we're back and able to get him moving again. I'd like to begin with a quick review to remind us that Jesus belonged to three different primary groups. The first one was his biological family in Nazareth, where he grew up. He went then to join John the Baptist group, another primary group, and was with John until John was arrested. And then he went with a few of John's followers back to Galilee and became the leader of another primary group that we can call discipleship groups that he began to establish in the villages around Galilee. Jesus was on campaign, and we could call his campaign the coming of the kingdom of God, and he developed those primary discipleship communities that we can maybe call not only discipleship communities, but kingdom communities. Jesus' words and deeds always fall within the context of those discipleship or kingdom communities. When Jesus was born, Israel was ruled by a guy named Herod. And the kingdom was really called the kingdom of Herod. He was put on the throne by the Roman emperor of the time. He shortly dies after Jesus' birth, and it's really his sons that we need to talk about as Jesus moves from Galilee to Jerusalem. And so after his death, his kingdom is divided into thirds to three of his sons. After the death of Herod, his three oldest sons jump on a ship and head to Rome to talk to Emperor Tiberius to make their cases on who should rule after their father Herod. Tiberius decides he's going to split up the kingdom among the three of them. You know, that sense of divide and conquer? So for our purpose, what's really important are two of the sons. Herod Antipas, who was the oldest son of Herod, and Herod Antipas, who was the second oldest. If you look at the map carefully, you'll notice Herod Antipas ruled Judah and Galilee, but he only ruled for about 9 years. Did not get along well with the people who lived there. Actually did not treat them very well, and eventually the Roman Emperor Tiberius exiled him to France. And once he was exiled, that region of Israel were ruled by governors. The most well-known we have is Pontius Pilate. If you look at the territory that's in purple, that is the territory that Herod Antipas ruled. And if you notice, there's two sections. The bottom section is east of the Jordan River. And that's where John the Baptist was. And once John the Baptist was arrested, Jesus and some of John's disciples went back up to Galilee. So John the Baptist and Jesus both were both in the territory that were ruled by Herod Antipas. And this is where we're going to begin to think about Jesus going from Galilee to Jerusalem. We're going to zoom in on the territory that Herod Antipas ruled and ponder a couple things. First, I want you to remember that it was Herod Antipas that had John the Baptist arrested and then took him and put him in prison in Tiberias, his capital, and eventually had John the Baptist beheaded. Jesus' ministry happened in Galilee, amongst the villages of Galilee, where Herod Antipas ruled. So why did Jesus decide to go to Jerusalem to confront the leaders there instead of go to Tiberias to confront the ruler that controlled Galilee? That's a question we need to ponder, but we may never know the answer to that. So hold on to that question from now. I also want to point out that the route Jesus probably took to Jerusalem was through the territory of Herod Antipas. He probably went down along the Jordan River and passed over to the eastern side of the river. And when he got to Jericho, then he moved over to the western shore and started up towards Jerusalem. We're going to turn now to look at the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John and see what they can tell us about Jesus going from Galilee to Jerusalem. This would be a good time to get out the document I sent along in the email with a link to this video, Jesus' journey from Galilee to Jerusalem. It breaks out the journey in the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And we're going to look first at the Gospel of Mark. If you notice, in the Gospel of Mark, Jesus' journey to Jerusalem takes one chapter. And there is a list of the events that happen in the Gospel of Mark. There's nothing remarkable about the list of the events as Jesus journeys from Galilee to Jerusalem, and probably we do not need to historically pin them to this journey, but rather to those village discipleship communities. What is important is Jesus' teaching of them on the way as part of that way we walk, and it highlights them as significant stories. When we look at the column with Matthew's journey of Jesus from Galilee, you note that he just follows the same order as the Gospel of Mark, except for one unique story that Matthew inserts. This is how Matthew writes. He follows Mark's orders, and sometimes he'll insert a story in his gospel, or he'll insert large segments in his gospels. But overall, his gospel follows the order of Mark. But when we get to the column with the Gospel of Luke, Luke follows the order of Mark. But at the beginning of the journey, Luke throws in just this honking amount of brand new stories, many of which you only find in the Gospel of Luke, like the story of the Good Samaritan, and like the story of the prodigal son, and many other ones that are beloved in Christian tradition from the Gospel of Luke are found in these 9 chapters. And now we get to the Gospel of John. And if you notice, John doesn't have a column on the page of Jesus going from Galilee to Jerusalem. That's because in the Gospel of John, Jesus goes to Jerusalem at least 3 times. In the Gospels of Matthew and Mark and Luke, Jesus' campaign happens in Galilee. He goes from Galilee to Jerusalem once, where he is arrested and executed. But in the Gospel of John, John has Jesus going back and forth from Galilee to Jerusalem, leaving open the possibility that Jesus may have gone to Jerusalem more than once. And this is probably true. Jesus probably went at least once a year from Galilee to Jerusalem to celebrate important Jewish festivals like the Passover. And if Jesus went back and forth from Galilee to Jerusalem at least once a year, is there potential that he started at least a discipleship group, if not a couple discipleship group, in Jerusalem and the area around Jerusalem? That's what we'll want to look at, and we will look at our sources of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John to discover what we may, if we're lucky, have for discipleship groups around Jerusalem. So one of the things to remember as we are analyzing our Gospels as sources, Matthew, Mark, and Luke go together. Much of what Matthew and Mark have, they inherit, much of what Matthew and Luke have, they inherit from Mark. And Matthew and Luke also have a collection of Jesus sayings that they inherit from another source. My suggestion is the Gospel of John stands by itself. And so with those 4 sources, are there stories or teachings we can pull out that may give us a clue about discipleship community or communities around or in Jerusalem? There are a couple stories and a couple names worth looking at in the Gospels of Luke and the Gospel of John. Both of them have unique stories with characters of the same name that take place around Jerusalem. The Gospel of John has a story about a character named Lazarus who dies. And the Gospel of Luke has a story about a character named Lazarus who dies. And the Gospel of Luke have a story with 2 characters named Mary and Martha. And coincidentally, in the Gospel of John, the same character Lazarus dies has 2 sisters named Mary and Martha. The significance of these 3 stories is that they come from 2 unrelated sources. One unique to the Gospel of Luke, the other unique to the Gospel of John. So we have some instances of names and stories set around Jerusalem that may go back past the writing of the Gospels. And I think we need to be real careful here. This is not the best of evidence to say that Jesus started up discipleship groups in or around Jerusalem. But we have one more piece to look at that is very, very important. What could be the most important discipleship group for the Christian tradition may have been in Jerusalem. And it is this group that gives to us Jesus' passion story, his last night and meal with his disciples, going to Gethsemane to pray, being arrested, being interrogated, being tortured, being executed, and then being raised from the dead. This is a Jerusalem discipleship group that Jesus developed right after his death. And what is interesting, the person that is traditionally said to lead this group has a book in our sacred story, a book called James. And James just happens to be the brother of Jesus. So we have gotten Jesus from Galilee to Jerusalem, but we haven't gotten him into Jerusalem yet. We will get Jesus into Jerusalem during our next session.